Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. Tonight, we're doing a book review. Done a few of these before. Folks usually enjoy them. I think we're all at the point in our collecting lives where, yeah, we like to be able to read stuff about the music that we love, learn more of the details that we never picked up on before, and just gives us something fun to do with our leisure time. So, our book for this evening's review is Rotting Ways to Misery. This is the history of the Finnish death metal. It came out in 2020 on Decibel Books, tied to the magazine publication, of course. I believe the US edition came out in 2021, so a little bit later in the US, but nice hardback book. Authors on this one are Markus Makkanen. He has been in various Finnish death metal bands, most notably currently Hooded Menace, and also Kim Stromsolm, who is a little bit more old school than Marcus, I think. He was in some bands back in the day, including Festerday is one that I remember. So, what do we think of this particular volume? Well, I picked this up out of curiosity. I had not read it, and the Finnish death metal scene is not one I am really that familiar with. I know the big things, of course, but didn't really know a lot of the second tier acts or much about the demo stuff. For whatever reason, I just rarely encountered many of those things and never got much of that stuff doing tape trading back in the day. So it seemed like an interesting topic to read up on. The book is organized pretty much the way you'd expect it to be. It starts out in the first chapter or two talking a little bit about Finland and the heavy music scene in the 1980s. Spoiler alert, there wasn't much of one. They had a couple of bands, acts like Riff Raff, for example. But yeah, Finland was pretty quiet as heavy metal was breaking out in other parts of Europe during, the early and mid 80s. Uh, they then transitioned into the late 80s where Finland started to develop a thrash metal scene, and this happened pretty naturally. Kids started hearing albums like Master of Puppets and Rain and Blood and thought, that's awesome. I want to do that too. Started putting bands together and started reading about other bands and zines, got into the global tape trading network. So they were getting stuff from the US, Obituary, Death, the usual suspects. Getting tapes also from Brazil. Multiple people they talked to throughout the book cite getting tapes from bands like Sepultura and other Brazilian acts. So they were definitely getting some of the more heavy, very extreme stuff in the early phases of death metal's evolution. And so, the thrash metal bands that started in Finland had kind of morphed, it sounded like, into more speed metal bands as you got towards the tail end of the 80s. But in a lot of people's eyes, the speed metal bands were not necessarily that serious. In a way, they never used the phrase, but it sounds like the thrash speed transition there was the bands were maybe emulating stuff like very late 80s Anthrax, where getting a little bit too much into the pizza thrash kind of silliness. I know some folks don't like that phrase, but it does pretty accurately describe the general just kind of silly one-dimensional party mentality that some thrash stuff went through at that time. So yeah, that phase kind of came and went very quickly, and some of those bands that wanted to be more serious about things started turning towards death metal. And they go through several bands that are kind of transitioning, where some of those thrash bands are getting a little heavier, kind of pushing right up against death metal, and eventually then some bands starting out as death metal rather than thrash bands that had been around for a year or two that was starting to have their sound evolve. At that point, they have chapters dedicated to each of sort of the bigger bands, as you'd expect. Which is how the book is mostly organized. After that point, you get one chapter per band, and there's a ton of them listed here. I'm not going to read the entire table of contents, but you have chapters, for example, on Disgrace, Zesma, Funebra, Necropsy, Abhorrence, Amorphis, Sentenced, Pertinence, Convulse, Mordicus, Demigod, Demolich, Thurgothan, Phlegethon, on and on and on. It's a pretty extensive list that they go through, which is something I like about the book. It looks like they did try to be very comprehensive and touch on as many bands as they could. Towards the end of the book, there's a couple of chapters that are sort of like a roundup of smaller bands, ones that never really got much past the demo stage. Maybe they had a 7-inch or something put out. So there's not enough on those bands to do a chapter each, but they each get, 1 to 3 paragraphs just to make sure that they are included, noted, what their demos were like and stuff like that. So the book is really aiming to cover that early 90s Finnish death metal scene as completely as they can. Now, something they do not do for the bands whose sound evolved past death metal, they don't track those bands into the later parts of their career. For example, with Amorphis, they talk a lot about the early material, Carillion Isthmus, Tales from a Thousand Lakes, but that's about where they start to stop off. They maybe touch on the material after that just briefly, but they don't really follow all throughout Amorphis's career album by album. The same with Sentenced. They cover the first 3 or 4 Sentenced albums, but they get to Down, it's like, okay, and at this point they're changing style, and that moves beyond the scope of death metal, and thus beyond the scope of this book. So, if you're wanting an entire history of bands like Sentenced or Amorphis, this is not the place to look. This covers the early formative years, those very first few very sort of, impressionable releases that were a big impact on the scene, but it's not going to walk you through all the transitions that they did through the later parts of their career where, they follow different musical pathways. I think both of those bands have books written about them. So if you want the full Amorphous story or, VH1 Sentenced Behind the Music, yeah, those books are out there. You can read them. I'm not sure they've both been published in English, though. So you might have to brush up on your Finnish. Is that a good thing or a bad thing that they didn't include that material? In a way, it'd be nice if they had included it just to have, a more comprehensive look at those bands' careers. At the same time, it does keep the book more focused on exactly what it says on the cover, just sticking to the Finnish death metal scene, not the Finnish death metal bands who 10 years later were playing, gloomy goth rock or pretty sounding melodic death or other stuff. So personally, I'm okay with them having left that material out and saying we're just going to talk about their death metal material and you can find out about the rest of their career someplace else. An advantage to that, one reason I like that they did this, is that it keeps the book moving. You don't end up with a 78-page chapter about Amorphis and a 6-page chapter about Pertinence. The material is paced pretty nicely. The chapters, some are longer than others, of course, but they read very easily. They move from chapter to chapter very well. There's plenty of pictures, band photos from back in the day, pictures of demos, 7 inches, LP covers. So lots of visuals to go along with the text. It never really feels like it bogs down or anything. You don't get halfway through the sentence chapter and feel like you've been reading it for days trying to get on to the next band. So yeah, the book paces itself very well. Other things to note, there are a few places here and there throughout the writing where the English is maybe just a hair off. You'll run into the occasional phrasing here or there where it's like, it's not quite right, but this is a very, very minor thing. It should not interrupt anybody's ability to enjoy or comprehend what the book is trying to say. Yeah, there's just 1 or 2 places where you can maybe notice, like, okay, that's not worded quite right for the English language, but again, very, very minor issue with that. Other things with the book, towards the end, they also spend some time talking about what happened to the Finnish death metal scene. And that was one of the things that was most interesting to me about the book. Yes, it's cool to be able to read through, each band's biography, but after a while, those do just become lists of names and, this person joins, they're on guitar, they're out in 4 months, they bring in this other person. That can start to read like stereo instructions. Insert drummer B into slot A in band C. Nobody's going to memorize that kind of stuff from reading the book one time. If you want to know it, you go back to the chapter on that band and you look it back up. What's more interesting is, their kind of take on, what happened to the scene and why did it sort of flare up very quickly and then also kind of fade out very, very quickly. something that lots of people they interview in the book, and they do seem to be able to talk to most of the sort of major players from the original Finnish death metal scene. A lot of them note that, yeah, all of a sudden 1991 death metal is kind of working its way up in Finland. It's this big deal, but by 94, 95, it's all but extinct. So that's a very narrow window of time for death metal, to be a thing. And there are reasons for that they go into. So that's kind of the more interesting part of the book to me. Now, in a way, what was happening in Finland kind of emulates what happened in other countries as well. Death metal kind of gets up and going in the late 80s. By the end of the 80s, it's clearly kind of the new direction to go in. In the early 90s, it explodes, but then, through the rest of the 90s, it, kind of, loses ground. So what happened in Finland isn't that different. It just seems to have happened on maybe a little bit more of a compacted scale. Since, folks in Finland weren't getting bands up and running until about, 1990, give or take several months, means, they were a little behind, the development of death metal in the United States or other places. Yeah, and the fact that it really did come to, not a complete halt, but it definitely hit a wall somewhere there around 94, yeah, again, plus or minus a handful of months. Whereas in other countries, the die down of death metal hype was maybe a little more gradual than that. Something they stress, in the book is that all these bands were made up with teenagers. These were high school age kids that were bored, looking for the next sort of extreme thing. They're doing what teenagers in any country do. What's kind of the big, loud, colorful, noisy, scary, shocking thing that's going to kind of shake them out of the teenage everything's boring and I hate life doldrums. No, death metal, that's crazy and extreme and scares people. Let's do that. But after a few years, you start to grow out of that. And something folks in Finland have to do that is different from other countries is they have to, do a year of service. A lot of them do a year service in the military when they're like 18 to 19. Others, it may not be military service, but maybe some other kind of, government service. That's the kind of thing that definitely puts your band on halt when, 3 of the 5 members all of a sudden have to disappear for a year to, go fill their, service requirement. And you come back from that, and yeah, you've grown up a bit, you've heard more music, your tastes start to change. And that was another thing that a lot of people commented on in here was that they simply started hearing more music besides just Death and Obituary and Slayer and Carcass. And like, hey, this other stuff is really cool too. Maybe we want to move on into those directions. Maybe you get the sense some of them started to feel death metal was, a little limiting, a little boring, maybe a little juvenile. And yeah, once they come out of, the other side of, being 20 years old, they've done their year of service, they're starting families and stuff. And yeah, maybe death metal just wasn't, it didn't have the shock value. It didn't have the same appeal for them anymore. Another thing that the book does, and I think most folks familiar with Finnish death metal are already familiar with, it highlights the fact that the bands did have their own unique sounds. That from a very early stage in the Finnish scene, a lot of the musicians got it in their heads early on to be different, to try to put their own unique spin on things. That they didn't want to just sound exactly like Carcass or exactly like Death or exactly like Obituary, and they didn't want to sound exactly like each other. So each band was trying to incorporate some different elements here and there. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of fans of Finnish death metal find very endearing about the scene, is that these bands really did each put their own fingerprint on the music they were creating. Even though, yeah, most of them lasted a relatively short time, and as such, there was only so much music put out. A lot of these bands, it's, a couple of demos, maybe a full length, maybe a couple of EPs, maybe 2 full lengths. But yeah, for most of them, it's a very, very short career. And, in a way, that's probably another thing that makes it an interesting and endearing scene to, dig into, is that these bands didn't last long enough to start sucking and putting out, half-baked albums that was a problem with death metal bands and other scenes. A lot of other bands went, to death and roll stuff, lost key members, vocalist changes, and Yeah, or just started making the same album over and over and over, and it got boring after a while. Most of these bands had called it a day before any of those things could happen. So all we really know of them is that, one, brief window of time where they're all young, very full of, piss and vinegar, and looking to, make, very unique but raging death metal. And so, yeah, people can still, connect with that. That's what they liked. That's all there is. They don't have to think, oh yeah, that first album was good, and then Demilich went on and made 5 more albums, and they wandered off, into mellow death metalcore territory or something. Now, some of the bands did do that, though. To be fair, there were some that changed styles early on and did put out some music that was very, very different. The book touches on those things, and they're fair about it. They don't trash it, but they do point out that they definitely lost some fans on the way, maybe gained other ones, but that was just part of how the scene very rapidly evolved. So that by the mid 90s, 95, 96 or so, there just wasn't much Finnish death metal going on anymore. There is a chapter at the end that touches briefly on sort of the resurgence of Finnish death metal that's happened in the 2010s, mentioning some of the bands that have come along and, kind of picked up that torch, reignited it, and started doing their own thing again. That's a relatively brief chapter, but it does touch on a few of the highlights to let folks know, what's going on more currently, and that it wasn't just a scene that completely disappeared and never had any follow up. So, that's Rotting Ways to Misery in a nutshell. It's a good read, very easy read. As I said, moves very well, lots of cool graphic content as well. So for folks that aren't familiar with a lot of this stuff, this definitely points you towards a lot of things that you could check out. It's also nice they mention along the way whenever bands have had like anthologies put out later on, so that yes, you don't feel like, oh, I'd love to hear that stuff, but I either just listen to it on YouTube or I pay hundreds of dollars for a 30-year-old original press if I can find it on Discogs. No, a lot of these bands have had their material archived within the past decade or so on different labels. So you've got that route to help you investigate them as well, if you're interested in doing so. So yeah, a cool read. If you are interested in the scene but haven't picked this up, I'd recommend it. Cover price is $29.95. You can still order it straight from Decibel. They ship relatively fast, so very easy to obtain this for those who are interested. All right, that is going to do it for this book review. So now let's talk metal in the comments down below. Have you read the book? And if so, what did you think of it? Again, it is a scene that I'm not very familiar with coming into the book at all, so other people may have more insightful critiques on it. Are there big chunks of material that they did gloss over that I'm just not aware of? Do you wish they had gone into more detail with some of the bands that strayed further from metal? Or are you glad they really kept it to, just those, really primal raging death metal years? What are some of your favorites from the Finnish death metal scene besides the obvious ones? I think, Demilich, Demigod, Amorphis, Sentence. Folks have kind of got that nailed down pretty well at this point. But what are some of the other maybe overlooked gems that you'd like to recommend for folks to check out if they want to explore the death metal scene from Finland in the early 1990s? Leave a comment down below so everybody can check it out and learn from your experience too. All right, that is going to do it for this time. So until the next video, everybody take care. And as always, of course, keep banging your head.